Hi, my name is Martin Nielsen, and I'm a horse parasitologist, and this is my research lab here at the University of Kentucky. Welcome to episode 3 of this video series on the horse's parasites. So yes, this was episode 3. We are on a journey through the horse's life. So we're doing all the parasites in the order of appearance. So if you have not watched episodes 1 and 2, you might want to go back and watch those first before you go on with this one. But today we have a really exciting parasite for you all to talk about. We're going to talk about the small Strongyles, or as we call it with a scientific term, the cyathostomins. Now, there's a lot of lay terms out there that people use about this parasite. I often get asked, don't you really have anything that's sort of easier to remember than cyathostomins? And yeah, I agree. It's a bit difficult to go around and remember all these Latin names. The problem is with some of these lay terms that they're somewhat misleading. I often hear the term small bloodworms. That's very, very misleading because these parasites do not have anything to do with the blood. They do not migrate in the blood. They do not eat blood. They basically just don't have anything to do with it. So don't call it that. I also often hear the term small redworms or just redworms. That's also slightly misleading because most of these are actually not red. Let's look at this picture here. Here's a collection of small Strongyles worms from a horse, and you can see that there are some on there that are red, but most of them are not. There are a few that might be a little pinkish if you want, but most of them are just pale and white. And then the other thing, which I think is good to have, small, the denotion small, because they are really small. You know, I have this little jar here, call it my snow globe. These are actually the worms that you can see there, the slowly dropping to the bottom. And you know, I wanted to just show you that they're really, really, really small. I emphasize this because I know a lot of horse owners that really are very keen on checking their horse's poop to see if they find any worms. Especially after deworming their horses, they're going to check the poop in the days following. You're going to struggle finding these because they're going to be mixed in with the feces, and that makes it really hard to see them. So horses can have easily 100,000 of these, but you may not see them at all. So you know, that's not the best diagnostic method, and it's fine to be checking their horse's poop. I do it all the time. It's a hobby of mine, if you will, as a parasitologist. But we just have to be aware that, you know, the smaller worms we could miss. And we will see the larger things much, much more easily. But that may not mean that they caused any harm. So that's a little bit about the name. And now, as a parasitologist, as you know, if you watch the other 2 videos, we cannot really talk about any parasite without going over the life cycle. So let's get to that and pull that slide up here. So here we have it. At a first glance, it looks pretty straightforward and simple. You know, we have one route of infection. That's the fecal oral route, as we call it, where horses eat something that's contaminated with the parasitic larvae, and then they get infected that way. So, you know, pretty simple. But this life cycle is actually very fascinating, and it has a couple of unique features that you actually don't see with any other parasites at all. And so what happens when the larvae get inside the horse is that they go through different stages, so different larval stages. We can call it like childhood, and then they're teenagers for a while, then they become young adults, and then finally they become adults. Male meets female, they reproduce, and they produce quite and cute offspring. Now, that's also pretty straightforward, but those teenagers actually do a couple interesting things. They leave the intestinal tract and they burrow into the walls of the large intestine, and then they hang out there for a while. So if you look at this thing here, So this is a piece of dried intestinal wall, and those red dots that you see there are actually, each of those dots represent one larvae. So those are the larvae that are sitting in the wall. And then, while doing that, they go through a couple phases, and then they come out, they make it back into the intestine. Now, what's interesting is that they can decide to put their life cycle on hold while hanging out here. Basically set everything to pause and just sit and wait it out for as long as they need to. We were not actually sure exactly how long, but it is several years that they can just basically hibernate, if you will, and hang out, drag it out, and then resume their life cycle when they need to. So what's the point with that? Well, that means that even if the horse is removed from an environment where it can acquire this infection, which would be on pasture, so that horse gets moved to either confinement, stall, barn, or to a part of the world where there's not much grass and everything is dry, then it could still get parasites because there's going to be a pool of these larvae sitting, and then the recruits can be recruited and they can populate the intestine, even in the absence of new infection. And this is something that some of you may have experienced. I've picked up poop on my horse's paddocks for 2 years, and one of them is still shedding eggs. How is that possible? This is why, and this is normal. Now, what causes this to happen? We call it actually arrested development. It's not, think about the teenagers that are self-isolating in their rooms. I don't know if you can imagine, they sit there up in their rooms, and then they only come out when they're hungry. Does that ring a bell? And then they can go into this arrested development. Now, arrested teenagers, that's different, and let's not go there, but the arrested development just means that they stop developing. And what actually is the mechanism behind that? We know something about this. This is something we have researched. So we know it has to do with the horse's immune response to the parasites. So in the foals that are exposed to this parasite for the very first time in their lives, there is no arrested development. The parasites do not go into that pause. They just continue right through all the phases of the life cycle. Second year, when they basically are introduced to the parasites again next grazing season, that's where we start seeing this arrested development, because that's where the horse has already been exposed once to the parasites, and there is that immune response that basically tries to keep these parasites at check, at bay. The immune system isn't really capable of eliminating these parasites, but it is capable to some extent of holding the parasites at bay. And one of the mechanisms is to trigger this arrested development. So we see arrested development actually being seasonal in some climates, especially those climates where there is a parasite transmission season and then there is an off season where there's nothing going on. So when there's a concentration of larvae being ingested by horses and the dose is higher of larvae ingested per day, for example, that's when you see more encysted and arrested stages. So I sometimes meet some confusion about this. There's encysted larvae and arrested larvae, and that's true. And it's not like they're two different things necessarily. The arrested phase happens while encysted, but all of these larvae go through that encysted phase. So it's interesting because we're going to talk a little bit about more about these larvae once we get to the disease section. So there's also another interesting part of the life cycle. So let's pull that back up here. So if you look at the external phase, there's a development that has to happen before these parasites can infect a horse. And so you see the parasites are actually coming out as eggs with the feces, with the poop. And then these eggs will have to hatch and then develop into larvae. Now the larvae will come out and then they go through 3 different stages before they reach that infective stage. that whole development from egg to hatching, first stage, second stage, and third stage larva, that's all weather and temperature dependent. So a lot of you are asking me, how long should my paddock rest before it's free of the parasites? How long would it take for all of these parasitic larvae to be gone? That depends on where you are and what time of year it is and how the weather has been this year compared to your previous years. So to give you some general rules, if the temperature is below 6 degrees Celsius, that I think is about 45 Fahrenheit. Correct me if I'm wrong. Then we have no hatching. So this is also why if you collect your samples to be checked for parasite eggs, if they are kept refrigerated or in a cooler with an ice pack, that temperature will be below the 6 degree mark and the eggs will not hatch, and that makes that sample a reliable sample for your veterinarian to do the egg count with. So below 6 degrees, nothing happens. So what you get to, say, about 10 degrees Celsius, 50 degrees Fahrenheit, that's where we will start seeing this development happening, but it will be slow. It will take several weeks, maybe 3, 4, maybe even 5 weeks, depending on whether we're at 10 degrees or somewhat higher. If we get to 25 degrees Celsius, that's about 80 degrees Fahrenheit, that's about the optimum temperature for this development to happen and for the larvae to then survive and make it for as long as possible to increase the chances of a horse eating them. And so at 25 degrees Celsius, probably within a week, you'll have this development completed. If you get even higher, if you get into the 30s, well, this development will go a lot faster, but then the larvae will also start struggling because it's tough to hang out in a very warm environment and without being picked up by a horse. These larvae, the third stage larvae, cannot eat any food. They basically have a cover in front of their mouth, and so they just have to rely on whatever they brought with them in their lunchbox. And that will run out at some point. And if you're in a warm environment, you move around a lot more, if you're a larva at least, and then you use up those energy reserves much, much quicker. If you get above 40 degrees Celsius, or I think that's 102 Fahrenheit, correct me if I'm wrong, somewhere around there, these larvae and the eggs will die out very, very quickly. So there's a scale here as to how quickly all of this happens. Now, if we look at how does this translate into what we would term the parasite transmission season, and that's actually quite important. So each region will be different, each locality will depend on what weather that offers. How warm does it get? What's the level of moisture, etc., etc. So we developed a computer model that can predict this, and that computer model imports data from a given weather station, and there's a lot of weather stations around the world, and most of these will make all its data available so you can download that and import it into the computer. And then the computer will spit out graphs that look like this. So here we have the months of the year. This is for a location in North Dakota. We imported 10 years worth of weather data, and that curve shows us the percent successful development from egg to third stage larva, to that infective stage of the small Strongyles. And you can see that there's like a peak there over the middle of the summer, beginning of fall, like Indian summer there. But what we know about North Dakota as an example is that they have very nice and quite intense summers, but they also have very cold winters with a lot of frost, which is very cold, and a lot of snow. Now, the parasite larvae actually like the frost, they like the snow, they survive very well, but they don't develop. They basically go into hibernation there. So there will be no transmission under those circumstances, but larvae can survive until weather conditions actually improve. But as we can tell here from this example, a cold climate with a short, intense summer is that the parasite transmission season is also short and intense. So let's compare that to another climate. Here is the state of Georgia here in the US. If you've ever been to Georgia, I spent part of my PhD there. the summers can get quite hot and humid. And if we look at the graph here, we notice right away that the parasite transmission season is substantially longer in Georgia compared to North Dakota that we just looked at. There is a little bit of a dip in the winter, especially first month or two of the year, but rest of the year there's actually pretty good conditions for parasite development into that infective stage. And so when the parasite transmission season is longer, then your decisions as to when should I go collect my fecal samples from my horse, when should I deworm, and with what, will also change, because you need to take into account when the parasite transmission is even happening. There's a little bit of a dip right here in this curve in the middle of the summer, not much, but a little bit, and this could be more pronounced in even warmer climates. And that's because in the middle of the summer in Georgia, we do reach temperatures above that 40 degrees Celsius or 102 Fahrenheit degree mark, where eggs and larvae of these Strongyles parasites basically just really can't make it for very long. So talk to you a bit about what your climate is like and what the parasite transmission season is in your area when you work on constructing your parasite control program. So how common are these parasites? See, this is a message that I've been trying to bring across ever since I started working with equine parasites, and apparently I haven't done a very good job. I still encounter lots of horse owners, even veterinarians, and also veterinary authorities in different countries that don't seem to understand that all horses have these parasites. All horses get small Strongyles. It is the expected finding. No one should be surprised. And I've been thinking about how can I best communicate that in an effective manner. So maybe I should try this. Breaking news. We are interrupting this programming with a major announcement. Horses will always have worms. The stock market is responding positively to this message, and the Dow Jones has just increased by 3,000 EPG. We here at Worms and Critters TV Live will continue to monitor this situation and get back to you with more news. Back to the studio. Yeah, maybe it'll fly. We'll see. But at least all horses have this parasite. Some will not have egg counts that are above the detection limit of the method that we use for determining fecal egg counts, but they all have these parasites to one degree or the other. Now, it's interesting that if you follow a herd of animals through the year, we've done that with our parasitology research animals, this herd that hasn't been dewormed since 1979. And let's look at a population of adult horses here. As you can see, there's some fluctuation up and down over the course of the year, but what we noticed is that, despite the seasonality in transmission season that I talked about earlier, we don't really see a seasonality in parasite egg output from these animals. So an egg count can be just as useful in the winter as it can be in the summer, and I just wanted to also emphasize that because a lot of people think that we can't really trust an egg count in the winter, and it's actually not true. Now, when do these Strongyles parasites start becoming the dominant parasite of the horse? So you watch the other two episodes of this series, you know that the first parasite that the horses get is Strongyloides westeri, first few months, couple of months of life. Then between 3 and 6 months of life, now we see ascarid parasites in the foals. And once we get to weaning, we then will see the Strongyles parasites being the dominant parasite. So let's look at a graph from the foals from this from this herd of horses that we have that doesn't get dewormed. So these are the foals, and you'll just notice that they do get a low level of Strongyles egg shedding even early on in life, even when they're 3, 4, 5 months of age. They do have a little bit of Strongyles egg counts there in the background, but this is right when they have this dominance of the ascarid parasites that we talked about in episode 2. Once we get rid of the ascarids, that's where these will start jump up, and then get very high. And in the yearling year, that's where we see the highest egg counts in horses in general, and also the highest worm burdens. And as they get older, they get past the yearling year, slowly and gradually, these counts will go down. Horses will get lower and lower worm counts, lower and lower egg counts. Now, with differences, because within a given herd, we typically see a couple of horses have very high counts, and they keep maintaining very high counts, and the large majority having very low counts or even negative counts, 0 egg counts. And that's the typical picture. We call that the 20-80 rule. So 20% of the horses are shedding 80% of that total egg output in that herd, and that's the normal picture. Doesn't mean that those high egg count horses are at risk of getting sick from the parasites. It doesn't even mean they have more worms. It just means that they are the responsible ones for the parasite infection pressure in that herd. So that's certainly important to keep in mind. Also, once you get into very old horses, what we call geriatrics, horses that are maybe older than, say, 20 years of age, sometimes we see those egg counts starting to be a little bit higher again. Just because old age, the immune system isn't as functional as it was when they were younger. Also, the older a horse gets, it can also get other conditions such as metabolic syndrome and an endocrine disorder that we call Cushing's disease, or PPID. And it has been shown that horses with that condition will tend to have higher parasite egg counts, higher Strongyles parasite egg counts. And so there's certainly reason, if you have an older horse, to make sure that you have an appropriate parasite control program in place, and that you check that horse with fecal samples to check where the level of parasite egg count is. Now, what kind of disease do these actually cause? And I think that's the whole point with this talk, is that this parasite can cause disease. Now, if we consider that every single horse in the world gets these larvae and these worms, it is extremely few. It's not even worth talking about percent of horses. We're down to promilla, or perhaps even lower. It's very, very few horses that ever sustain disease that can be associated with these parasites. So that's important. But there is a syndrome, a clinical disease syndrome, that's been termed larval cyathostominosis. And I know it sounds fancy and technical and complicated, but whenever something ends on osis in veterinary speak, that just means disease. So this is disease caused by larval stages of cyathostomin parasites, larval cyathostominosis. That's the disease. It's caused by these larvae. We can look at a picture of them as well on a more fresh specimen here. Those little red dots, that's what causes the disease. If you have hundreds of thousands of these and they decide to want to make it back to the intestine all at once, that's where the lesions are happening. So each of these will leave behind a small hole with a little bit of a reaction around it, so inflammatory reaction. Now that's fine if there's just one hole, and if there's like a few holes and a few hundred holes, that's not a problem at all for that intestine to heal. But if you have hundreds of thousands of them, then you get a generalized inflammatory condition of the entire large intestine. And the horse will then be very sick, and it'll have diarrhea. And it can be what we call profuse watery diarrhea. And the horses are also losing protein into that diarrhea. So we see these horses becoming very dehydrated, extremely dehydrated in some cases, and then they lose the protein out of the blood. So they will have fluids accumulating underneath the skin on the lower parts of the body. Right here on the chest, for example, is where you can feel these edema formation. And then they sometimes also get fever because there can be a bacterial infection on top of the parasitic infection. And these horses are critical patients. They need to be hospitalized, and they need critical care by veterinarians for them to have a chance to actually make it. Now, I've seen such cases. They were extremely rare. We would see maybe a few a year. when I was still in my home country, Denmark. But after moving here to the US, and I've been here 9 years, I have yet to see my first case. So there are some regional differences as to when it happens, where it happens, or if it happens at all. So this is a serious disease when it happens, but it happens so extremely rarely. Talk to your veterinarian about whether they actually see larval cyathostominosis in your area, and discuss with them if it's something you need to have you think about taking into account in your parasite control program. And so that's about the disease. There's a whole lot of times these parasites don't do anything at all, and that's really the rule. And it's not in the interest of the parasites to actually kill the horse, because that's kind of stupid when you think of it, because the horse is their home. So now let's talk about treatment. So what are the treatment options for these parasites? And the headline here is drug resistance. There is a lot of drug resistance in these parasites, and it's across the world. So let's pull up this chart. We only have 3 classes of dewormer, and we have widespread resistance to 2 out of the 3 classes, and then we have emerging resistance to the 3rd class. So take the benzimidazoles, for example. We're at a stage now where no matter where you look, you are extremely likely to find resistance in small Strongyles parasites to this group of dewormers. And so I want to emphasize, if you already have resistance to a benzimidazole dewormer, it will not help to treat with that same dewormer in a double dose for 5 consecutive days. I emphasize this because there is a type of product termed the Power Pack that does that, and a lot of people like to use it. My advice is check your dewormers, and if you have resistance to this class, there's no point in using that regimen. Similarly, the other class here, the parental products, same story. Resistance is almost as common as it is with the benzimidazoles. It's getting worse year by year. And if you already have resistance, there is absolutely no point in using one of those daily dewormers. The ones where you feed a feed additive to your horse every single day for a period of time. All of these daily dewormers, they have the parental products. So again, check your products, check your dewormers, and if they don't work, the daily dewormers won't work. Now, if you're not from North America and you're watching this video and you're wondering, daily dewormer, what? That sounds bizarre. Well, I agree with that, first of all. It is bizarre. And it's a product that only is on the market here in North America. So just for clarification. Now, I said there was emerging resistance to the 3rd drug class, and that's our ivermectin, our moxidectin, and similar products. Very, very important dewormers. They're dewormers that we use a lot. We rely upon them a lot. But we are concerned that we are beginning to see signs of resistance there as well. So we have this term in parasitology that we call egg reappearance period. Again, that sounds fancy, but it really isn't. It's just a matter of how many weeks does it take for a group of horses to start shedding eggs again. So it's the number of eggs that they keep the egg count 0 following deworming. So with the ivermectin and moxidectin products, those egg reappearance periods just used to be so much longer than they are today. So again, let's look at an example from a study we did. So you look at this graph here. This is a group of horses. They were dewormed with moxidectin in week 2, and as you can tell, the egg counts then went negative and stayed negative for a few weeks, but in week 5, they came back up positive. So that's an egg reappearance period of 4 weeks. Now, moxidectin used to suppress egg output in horses for 16 to 22 weeks. 16 to 22 weeks, and now we're down to 4. And this is not just one study. This has been found in a number of different studies. We have a dramatically reduced egg appearance period. The parasites basically just come back so much quicker now following deworming than they used to. And we've seen very similar findings for ivermectin type products. So the concern is, of course, that when we keep using these, we'll see that 4-week interval go down to maybe 3 weeks, and then we'll be down at 2. And at some point, the concern is that we will no longer see egg disappearance. And that, by definition, is actually drug resistance. So we don't have any new dewormers in the pipeline yet, so we have to be really smart about how we use our dewormers, and that we don't overuse them, and we use them for the right parasite at the right time. So just keep that in mind. We want to make sure we have effective dewormers for whenever a horse should get sick from its parasites. That's really the scenario we're trying to maintain. So that's all I have for today for this very important parasite, the small Strongyles parasites, or the cyathostomins. And so what's the take-home message I want to leave you with? The cyathostomins, the small Strongyles, are the parasites that are everywhere, and where the teenagers stay in their rooms and only come out when they're hungry, or unless they get arrested, of course. With that, thank you for watching, and I'll see you again in the next episode. Thank you so much.